The Enlightenment was a time of philosophical fervor where the very idea of thought could change the world. New ideas of government and its responsibilities to its people were proposed. New rights for the people were theorized, all of which culminated in the birth of a new nation and the sparking of a revolution which would set Europe ablaze. Prior to the Enlightenment, very little, if any, rights existed for the common citizen. There was no freedom of speech, or expression, or even religion. In some areas, primarily Eastern Europe, most of the people lived in serfdom. They were essentially slaves, owned by the nobles, and bound to the land and their lifelong labor obligations. Rulers ruled with absolute authority, with the idea that their power was ordained by God, and to question their decisions was to challenge God. The only responsibility a ruler had was to create and maintain a strong nation and to secure more wealth than their enemies in accordance with the principles of mercantilism. However, with the introduction of the scientific revolution, all of this was to change thanks to the rise of the idea that knowledge could be found through reason and observation rather than faith and religion. This new method would trigger a wave of thought among philosophers, giving rise to those who would bring about the Enlightenment. These Enlightenment philosophers included John Locke, Immanuel Kant, Thomas Hobbes, Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau, as well as others. They were different from their predecessors because they actively challenged the government and agitated for change, specifically with their application of reason to justify individual rights. The consequence was that many governments did not approve of them, so they would meet in secret, for example, in salons in France. Here, philosophers would share and debate ideas as well as create new ones. It was also here they came up with the idea of how government should work and what rights the people should have. John Locke's second treatise of government outlines the main ideas of government formed during this time. These ideas suggested every person was born with a set of natural rights that are not granted by nor can be taken by any government. These inalienable rights were life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. He also stated that government is only formed when people willingly give up some of their rights to form it with the understanding that this government would protect their rights. The government would be limited in its power. It would not rule with absolute power and authority, and its leaders would be chosen by the people, not ruled by birthright. Power would not rest in one person who could do as they wish. Government would be split into branches: a legislative branch which would create the law, an executive branch which would enforce the law, and a judicial branch which would interpret the law. All three were to be bound by rules set by the people, and the people choose officials to represent them and their interests in government. Ultimately, power resided in the people. It was their responsibility to hold the government accountable for its actions, and it was the government's responsibility to protect the rights of the people and never pass a law which would trample on them. However, if the government were to fail in this responsibility and attempt to pass a law without the consent of the people or which violates their rights, the people are then no longer bound to obey and have the right to rebel and overthrow the government. These ideas were radical for the time and were ignored by most rulers in Europe. Some rulers even made it illegal to talk about this new idea of government. Only 3 rulers of Europe would even somewhat listen to the ideas of the Enlightenment. These 3 became the enlightened despots, and they included Catherine the Great of Russia, Frederick the Great of Prussia, and Joseph II of Austria. All 3 would attempt to bring Enlightenment changes to their nations, and they would mostly fail. Frederick was regarded widely as the most enlightened ruler of Europe. He brought about many governmental reforms, such as establishing a modern bureaucracy and introducing judicial reforms such as examinations required for appointment of higher judges and abolishing the use of torture. He even promoted religious toleration and freedom of speech and of the press. While he did grant a few rights to his people, he did not allow for full religious toleration, and as he grew older, he would become rigid and inflexible, which is a trait his government after him would inherit. His rule would be dominated by war and conquest, and he would fail to bring about the type of government and rights as described by John Locke, and most of his measures would die with him. In Russia, Catherine attempted to bring about Enlightenment changes by granting her people new rights, starting with the abolition of serfdom, but such a change would never be accepted by Russian aristocrats and nobles, so Catherine was unable to bring about any significant changes in the lives of the Russian people. Joseph of Austria brought about the most changes of the enlightened despots. He split his government into executive and judicial branches. He passed the Edict of Toleration, which granted equality before the law, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. He even ordered the full abolition of serfdom. However, such changes were not accepted by Austrian nobles and aristocracy. They, along with the Austrian Netherlands and Hungary, rebelled against Joseph, threatening the dissolution of his empire. After the rebellions broke out, he was forced to withdraw most of his changes, and when he died in 1790, his successor, Leopold II, withdrew all of his changes. Overall, any change in Europe brought about immediately by the Enlightenment was minimal to non-existent, and above all, the leaders of Europe, even the so-called enlightened despots, still ruled with absolute power and authority, with no one to check their power or question them, and very few, if any, rights granted to their subjects. However, where change did occur was in the British colonies in North America. Fed up with being taxed and having no representation in Parliament, along with tyrannical measures issued by the British, inspired by the ideas outlined by John Locke, the Founding Fathers would issue the Declaration of Independence, which described the people's natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They also outlined the idea that the power of the government comes from the people. Therefore, since the British failed in their responsibility to uphold the rights of the colonies, they were justified to use force to overthrow the government and form a new one. The American War for Independence would eventually bring about the birth of a new nation which followed the ideas of government theorized during the Enlightenment. A government that was formed by the consent of the people, where the people were granted rights that were not given nor could be taken by the government. A government split into three branches, with not one having more power than the other, with each other checking the others to form a balance of power. The power and the restrictions of each branch would be outlined in a constitution, along with the rights of the people. The people would elect representatives to represent their interests and be responsible for holding their government accountable for its actions by removing corrupt officials or, if necessary, overthrowing the government. The government would be responsible for acting only with the consent of the people and to never enact laws or other measures which would violate their rights. The Enlightenment gave birth to a new nation with a form of government that had not been seen since the days of the Greek and Roman republics. The ideas of limited government, as well as ideas of liberty and equality, would go on to inspire a revolution in France, the very birthplace of the Enlightenment, a revolution which would set Europe ablaze. This revolution would spread the ideas of rights and limited government throughout Europe, inspiring change in the decades afterwards, which would eventually give rise to most modern form of government seen in Europe today, where people now enjoy rights that were not possible prior to the Enlightenment, and the government is limited in its power and responsible to its people and protecting their rights, just as it was described in the ideas of the Enlightenment.